April 18, 1944. Camp Shelby, Mississippi. A windless, dust-sour morning that smelled of engine oil and cedar shavings. The column of captured men filed off the cattle trucks like a slow river of gray. Feldgrau uniforms stiff with sweat, boots scuffed with French mud. At the head of the line walked Hauptmann Karl Weiss, face drawn, tobacco-stained fingers worrying the strap of a water canteen. He carried the weight of 2 weeks of retreat and a neatly folded photograph of a wife whose name he whispered when the dust stung his eyes. American MPs in olive drab. Sergeant James Miller among them, a broad-shouldered man with a clipped, efficient manner, directed the men toward a grated intake tent. The MPs carried M1 Garens slung across their chests. Their polished helmets flashed in the sun. Nearby, a battered army ambulance idled, its engine tick-ticking as if exhausted from the work of transporting humans rather than goods. The camp had a rhythm, shouted commands, the clink of tin mess kits, the distant whine of a generator. It felt, to the Germans, like an organized world that had no place for the chaos they had just left. Inside the tent the air was cooler, scented faintly of coffee and disinfectant. A corporal with a clipboard, Corporal Thomas Reed, called names and ranks in clear, practice tones. Men stripped boots and belts, pockets emptied onto tarpaulins. Weiss watched, suspicious. Procedures felt like interrogation dressed as civility. Then, as if to contradict his expectations, a lanky army nurse pushed a crate into the tent. The wooden slats opened to reveal rows of wrapped chocolate bars and small, paper-wrapped cigarette cartons. The murmur that rose from the prisoners was a confused, almost audible gasp. Chocolate and cigarettes were small things in a war measured by artillery and blood, but to men trained under rigid Nazi discipline, where privation was part of obedience, the sight felt indecently generous. Weiss's jaw worked. Around him, other prisoners exchanged incredulous glances, some laughing a sharp, disbelieving laugh. A young Feldwebel, sergeant, Otto Bauer reached for a bar with the tentative reverence of a man touching relics. The camp, in that instant, began to reveal itself not as an extension of defeat, but as an alternate order with different rules, different expectations, an order that smelled of coffee, not fear. The sun hung high over Camp Shelby by the time the Germans were marched past the barracks. Long wooden huts lined with screened windows and flanked by tidy gravel paths. Rows of white laundry fluttered like surrender flags in the afternoon heat. Weiss noticed something strange, American soldiers laughing. Not mocking laughter, but genuine, relaxed, like men untouched by the war's grime. It was the kind of sound that felt forbidden after years under the shadow of Nazi discipline. Inside the barracks, each man found a neatly made bunk, a thin mattress, and even a pillow. A sign on the wall, in English and German, read, "Respect brings respect." A tin cup clinked onto the table beside every bed. Then came the sound, metallic and rhythmic, the dinner bell. They were herded toward the mess hall, expecting the usual gray broth and stale bread of army rations. Instead, the air hit them first, thick with the scent of roasted meat, onions, and yeast bread. Prisoners slowed their pace, their eyes scanning trays of food that looked more like something served to officers, not captives. Sergeant Miller nodded toward the line and barked, "Eat up, boys." No threats, no sneers, just efficiency. Otto Bauer hesitated, the chocolate from earlier still half unwrapped in his hand. He caught Weiss's eye, unsure whether to eat it or save it as proof that this wasn't a trick. Weiss finally nodded, wordlessly, the universal soldier's permission, and Bauer bit into it. His face froze, then softened. He closed his eyes, as if tasting a memory from before the war. Later that night, as the lights dimmed and crickets sang beyond the wire fence, Weiss sat on his bunk listening to the hum of a generator and the faint, scratchy sound of a radio playing swing music. Cigarette smoke drifted lazily toward the rafters. The guards outside chatted idly about baseball and girlfriends. It was surreal, this strange civility amid a world on fire. Weiss scribbled a note in his small field diary. "The Americans treat us not as enemies, but as men. They give us food, chocolate, even laughter. It feels more dangerous than hatred. By June 1944, Camp Shelby had become almost unrecognizable to the men who first arrived in disbelief. The fences were still there. The barbed wire still gleamed under the Mississippi sun, but the fear had drained out of daily life. The prisoners worked during the day, repairing roads, harvesting timber, or helping on nearby farms. In return, they were paid in camp currency, small printed chits they could use at the commissary to buy soap, postcards, or the most prized commodities of all, cigarettes and chocolate. It was the evenings, though, that truly broke through the old walls of obedience and ideology. Once a week, the camp projector sputtered to life and cast flickering light against a canvas sheet stretched between two poles. Rows of wooden benches filled quickly, prisoners shoulder to shoulder, their laughter and chatter blending with the smell of tobacco and dust. One night, the guard screamed Casablanca. As Humphrey Bogart's voice rolled through the humid night, Otto Bauer leaned forward, eyes wide. "They make films like this during the war?" he whispered to Weiss, as though the very idea defied logic. Weiss didn't answer. He simply stared at the screen, at the city of fog and lost causes, realizing that in another life, he might have watched the same film with his wife in Munich. Letters were permitted too. Each man could write to his family back home once a week. For many, it was the first time they dared to tell the truth, that they were alive, safe, and even treated well by the Americans. Some described the food, others the movies. One wrote simply, "They gave us chocolate. Real chocolate." The American guards were instructed to treat POWs according to the Geneva Convention, but many went beyond that, sharing jokes, cigarettes, or even trading language lessons. Sergeant Miller, on his evening rounds, often paused by the fence where Weiss and Bauer would sit under the floodlights' glow, talking in slow, halting English. Miller would hand them a fresh pack of Lucky Strikes and say, "Keep it easy, fellas. War's big enough for all of us." It wasn't friendship, not quite, but it was something dangerously close, a fragile bridge of decency built in a world that had forgotten what decency looked like. Not everyone in Camp Shelby welcomed the kindness. Some of the captured officers, particularly those steeped in Nazi ideology, saw every act of generosity as an American ploy, a psychological weapon meant to corrupt discipline. Oberleutnant Friedrich Kruger, a sharp-eyed veteran from the Afrika Korps, often lectured the younger soldiers at night. "Do not be fooled," he hissed one evening, pacing between bunks as a movie played in the recreation tent outside. "They want you soft. They want you to forget who you are. Cigarettes are bait. Chocolate is poison." His words hung in the air, uneasy and brittle. Otto Bauer glanced away, gripping his chocolate ration like a guilty secret. Weiss watched quietly, torn between his duty and the strange calm he had found here. He no longer believed in Kruger's warnings. The enemy he feared wasn't outside the fence anymore. It was inside, clinging to pride and fear. Over the next few weeks, the division among the prisoners deepened. Some refused to speak English, refused to work, even refused the small luxuries offered. Others, like Weiss and Bauer, embraced the routine of camp life. They worked hard, earned their tokens, and saved up for small pleasures, postcards, soap, coffee. For the first time in years, they began to feel human again. Then came the day Weiss was assigned to help an American mechanic repair a truck engine just outside the perimeter. The mechanic, Corporal Reed, offered him a wrench and said, "Figure you know your way around one of these, huh?" Weiss hesitated, then nodded. Hours passed in companionable silence, the two men sweating under the sun, trading nods instead of words. When the engine finally roared to life, Reed grinned and handed Weiss a bottle of Coca-Cola. Weiss stared at the cold glass in his hand. In the Reich, Coca-Cola had been a rare luxury reserved for propaganda officers and party officials. Now, standing in captivity, he was being offered one for free by the very enemy his leaders had told him was barbaric. That night, Weiss sat outside the barracks, sipping the last drops of the Coke as fireflies blinked beyond the wire. He thought about Kruger's words and realized the truth. This wasn't manipulation. This was what freedom looked like. Messy, strange, generous. By autumn of 1944, the once fearful German prisoners had settled into the rhythm of their new world. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of pine from the forests beyond Camp Shelby. Rumors of the Allies advancing in France filtered through Red Cross bulletins and guard conversations. Each scrap of news hit differently. For some, dread. For others, relief. Weiss found himself reading English newspapers now, slowly, sounding out the words. Bauer painted signs for the camp infirmary in perfect block letters. They had begun to change, not through propaganda or force, but through exposure to something profoundly simple: dignity. One night, as rain drummed against the tin roof, Weiss joined Sergeant Miller and a few guards under the overhang of the commissary. They shared cigarettes in silence, watching lightning crawl across the horizon. Miller finally broke the quiet. "You know, Carl," he said, using Weiss's first name now, "I used to think all you fellas were monsters. Guess I was wrong." Weiss exhaled, smoke curling upward like a memory leaving his chest. "And I was told Americans were fools," he replied with a faint smile. "Maybe we were both right and both wrong." Back in the barracks, Kruger's influence had withered. Men who once saluted him now saved their loyalty for survival, not ideology. The camp library, small, filled with donated books, became a sanctuary. Bauer read the grapes of wrath and murmured, "Even they suffer, even the victors." As the months slipped by, Red Cross parcels continued to arrive, filled with canned milk, letters, and more chocolate bars. To the Americans, these were small gestures of decency. To the Germans, they were proof that compassion could survive even in war. When news of Germany's collapse finally reached Camp Shelby in May 1945, the prisoners didn't cheer. They stood silently under the Mississippi sky, unsure whether to mourn or feel liberated. Weiss closed his diary that night with a final entry. "They gave us cigarettes and chocolate, but also something far rarer: respect. I do not know how to return home and pretend I never saw it." As the lights dimmed across the camp, the prisoners drifted to sleep to the faint hum of American radios playing jazz, the sound of a world already moving past the war. In the quiet corners of camps like Shelby, history whispered a different truth: that even in war, humanity could survive behind barbed wire. For those German POWs, chocolate and cigarettes became symbols of something far greater: mercy. If you found this story moving, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to America in Time, where we uncover the human side of history, one untold moment at a time.